Hello and welcome to the Amplitude podcast, where we talk about all the things that bring more quality customers to your website to buy and buy and buy. With us here today, Jeff Ferguson, who's head of production here at Amplitude Digital. Hello, Jeff.
Good to see you as always, Duff.
Good to see you too. Now, Jeff just published an article in the Search Engine Journal. It's called Why We Need to Stop Quoting the Zero-Click Search Studies. And as a traditional, we usually get behind the scenes and do a little director's cut. Just quickly kind of getting into this, I saw a bunch of things that are interesting in this article. In addition to what is the idea, what is zero-click search, there's also just a kind of what I call a meta concept that we've talked about before in articles that you've written for the Search Engine Journal about this sort of statistical relevance idea. What is good data? What is useful data? And what is data that's just really not data you want to rely on to utilize at all for SEO work? Please quickly just walk us through like what is statistical relevance as it relates to SEO and why does it so frequently trip people up?
Sure. So statistical relevance is this at its most basic level is the idea that you've got enough data to actually prove your point, right? And that it also ties into things like that the data comes from a pure source, that it's a random sample of the target audience that you want to talk to. There's a variety of different pieces of this puzzle that come up with it, but it's really this idea that that there's no bias built into the system from one way or the other. And, sometimes that bias can be intentional, sometimes it can be unintentional, whatever it is. Sometimes it's just a matter of like where, the data came from. Does it cause an accidental bias? Does it, whatever it is. And, the funny thing about bias is a lot of times if you're upfront about it and you're just going to say, hey, look, this is where this came from. And that, by the definition of that, this causes this problem. This is, this is going to be a thing for this whenever. However, I think this provides enough of a directional, suggestion that it's worth something like that. And I actually even do that a little bit in this article using data that is from like another similar study that was from a similar source. And it's really to kind of prove the points that we're like, if you're comparing like the light, it's okay, right? But in this case, the data set we were playing with, that Rand Fishkin was playing with for both of these studies, because it was two different studies, both had like problems and they both had similar problems to it. And it causes a bias that's called availability bias. And it's really the idea is that if you go through and actually collect data from a source that has not anything really to do with the purpose of your study in the first place, there's bound to be some bias in it for this thing. And so in this case, both of the studies we're going to talk about, one of them came from this company called Avast, which doesn't exist anymore, which used to push out a data set that was called Jump Shot. And that came from people that actually all used this antiviral software that would actually do a certain amount of tracking of searches and things like that, right? So there were some inherent problems that came with that. One, again, it was just, it was only the people that were using the software, right? So that's not necessarily a random sample of people. It excluded certain types of users. While it used people that were on Android users, it excluded everybody that was on an Apple device. So all the iOS users, right? So which is a big thing to it. I believe that was the one where it also it ignored other types of mobile searches or whatever it is. There was just big pieces of it that were missing, which we'll talk about later, but so that causes that problem too. And then the newer study uses a site called SimilarWeb, which I've used. SimilarWeb's it's a fine company, too. Right? Yeah, and it's a good way to kind of literally find out some bigger research things, and it's based on collective stuff, and it's good from like big picture director stuff, right? But in this case, we were talking about something really specific, which was gathering information for like what people are doing on Google. And unfortunately, with SimilarWeb, it's a bit of a black box, right? They actually do have some pages on their site that says like this is where we get our data and things like that, but it's intentionally vague. They claim they captured from a bunch of different apps, but they never really name those apps. They claim they get certain information from directly from Google Analytics, but in this case, like it's not like Google gave them access to their own Google Analytics account, so it's like it's who knows where that other information's coming from, right? So it's got problems basically to where this is, and that on its own would make that data very suspect, right? And so that was enough. And that was the one I covered last July in a larger piece that was about like the sad state of statistical studies as a good example of just, like this is a fantastic example of availability bias and cause whatever it is. And that was before this, the newer version of the study even came out this year. So, just this last month, it's actually coming up on actually exactly a month, I think, Rand put out another study on the SparkToro blog that was bringing the same thing, but this time the numbers were even worse for Google at the very least, as far as the zero-click searches go and things like that. And I decided I needed to go ahead and step up. I'd been saying it publicly before about, that I thought there were some real problems with this data and how it was organized and things like that. And I had notes, whatever it is. And even before I published this article, I was actually on another webinar recently that was a kind of a panel of different people that were talking about it. And that kind of inspired me to go ahead and just, get my notes together and pull everything together, because it sounded like it was just still a problem. And I was really kind of noticing from a statistical standpoint and a variety of other places, just how easy it was that, that Rand could push this study out here and how he would immediately get coverage on so many different blogs and things like that without anybody really questioning it, and I mean, and it's not like, I'm the lone gunman here that's asking like what the problem is. There were clearly other people that were kind of raising their hand and saying like, there were problems here, this is this, whatever it is. But it's one of the things where like, I felt like I needed to like come into one place, one solid article that said, this is everything that's going on with this one. And this is why we just need to stop bringing it up, because it does still just show up constantly in one form or the other.
Yeah, this is really interesting because there's different threads of, where is the data coming from? How good is it? And how useful is it? And then what are the conclusions that can or can't be drawn? Mm-hmm. So let's keep talking about this, but I'll put up these links so people can get over there and read that article, and they really should. But let's talk about now what is a quote zero-click search, and what is kind of the big controversy about right now about how they seem to be on the rise.
Right. So the actual definition, I think, of a zero-click search is where we really need to pay attention to. And it's given its name. You can kind of get an idea of like what it's going for. Somebody would actually do a search on Google. And then in that moment, they would not click on any link to go to like another outside website. Right. And this is a very legitimate, hey, this happens. This is going. And the reason why they're clicking elsewhere, right, could be a collection of other reasons, which we can get into. All right. But that's the idea is that, the no actual click takes place in that instance. Right. And it could, again, it could be things like, maybe they saw a featured snippet or a knowledge panel that answers their question in that moment, and a click isn't required because their question was answered in that moment. It could also be instances where maybe they get frustrated because they didn't find what they were looking like the first time, and so they actually go back and do another search. So again, they're like no click would have happened because no click was deserved, I guess is the best way to do it. And which is a kind of a category I created in the article called never clickers, right? These are people like, the click wasn't going to happen. Right? So you can't really count it as a zero click, but it just wasn't going to happen in the first place. There could also be other instances where because of some other sort of technology, a click doesn't happen. So voice search is a good example of that. So if you're doing it like through like a Google Home device or whatever it is, and you're asking a question on an answer is given, all that, that is counted as a search that doesn't get a click because the answer just appears in that instance, right? And so these are all like real things that are happening in those instances. There's another one that technically, could belong in here, and it's that's up for some discussion, I guess, where it's instances where maybe Google has its own service, right, that can actually provide this service to it. And that could be things like how Google now has services available for travel search for like hotel rooms and for flights and things like that, where you can actually do everything within the kind of the Google universe there. There's other instances where, maybe it's movie tickets, maybe it could be anything, right? But it's all information that where, the clicks all kind of stay in the, if they do happen, they all kind of stay in the Google universe. So it's not going to another outside website in instances, but usually that's separated out, right? As some, and some studies that do it, even Rand's study in another instance has done one where he kind of isolated. We're saying like, that's about 6% of the time do searches actually go to like Google properties in the grand scheme of things, right? And through other searches, they've, other research and things like they've done in the past, that was outside of these two SparkToro ones, but actually used the same data in one instance, but it was back when Rand was over at Moz. He kind of highlighted the fact that, the amount of searches that usually go to, like people that see featured snippets or knowledge panels, it's usually, like 12 to 15% in those areas. Sometimes it's 12. It depends on which one you're actually looking like. And then there was another chunk of people that actually, the ones that just like search for something and turn around and go home because not home, but they just don't find what they're looking for. So they do another search. And so those kind of collective between the featured snippet people and the never find what they're looking for, the never clickers that we call it, whatever it is, is usually around 20%. It depends on which one you look at. It could be as high as 30%, whatever it is. And that's kind of like the more legitimate side of like a true zero click kind of thing. And usually in that collective numbers that Rand has been pushing out lately, those ones kind of stand alone, and a much larger number that he claims happen.
Like twice that, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then there, obviously the numbers I talked about before of like these things go to Google themselves. Sometimes he keeps it separate. Sometimes he absorbs it into the slice, whatever it is. It all depends on which version of this he looks like, but it was kind of confusing on how it ended up looking. But in reality, and you kind of mentioned the size of it. So in the first study he did, which was back in 2019 that he released on it, he kind of made the point that it was now well over 50% of searches, and it wasn't well over. It was actually just a hair over 50% of Google searches were zero click searches. And then he came back just about a month ago and basically said that it was about 2/3. Now the number is like 2/3, right?
Yeah, 66.
But he doesn't. Yeah, it was. I think he gives like 60 and something or change, whatever it is. He based it like I think his real number was like 64. But he kind of said like there's probably some undercounting here, so we can easily say it's 2/3. That's not how numbers work, but that's what he did to make his headline kind of work, which is whatever. You can make that statement. It's your data. But the problem is with the second one was with a similar data, and we have even less information about like what's in those slices. But in the first study, and this is where I really took some umbrage with that first study, was that he had published this data. It had gone out with all these nice graphs and all these things about it, whatever it is. And then I guess people came back later on and had questions specifically about like what was included in the zero click slice. In those things. And so he went through and updated his post a while later. You can't actually tell how long it was between those things, but it was clearly after the initial post had gone out and after it was already getting picked up in the news and coverage and things like that. So articles had been written that quoted the 50% numbers or whatever it is. And in that, he basically went back and suggested, and he does admit that, it's made up of the people that couldn't find anything. There are people that saw featured snippets. He said voice search was in there like that. But then the big caveat, the really big problem that really caught my eye was there was a bunch of searches in there that actually were getting clicks, right? And the problem is that the technology used to collect this data wasn't able to capture the click. And it was something where it'd be instances where if somebody clicked on an app, for instance, where they'll say they're on mobile devices where they clicked on the app, they couldn't track it. Or if they went into something like Google Maps, which happens all the time, right? Or if they click on a phone number to actually like trigger a call out of the system, whatever it is, those things weren't counted because it's just the technology itself couldn't actually find them. So you had this nice big chunk of what it was here. And out of that 50%, as we said before, 20 to 30% of it, could be the featured snippet people. It could also be the people that just couldn't find anything and tried again later, the never clickers, as we called it. But then you've got this other part of it where it could be anywhere between 20 to 30% of that 50% that really were clickers. I mean, a click actually was happening in that instance that was going somewhere else or some other action. There was a satisfied customer in that instance because the click actually happened, according to his logic. And so it should have never just been in there, right? It should have never been part of that total 50% number because like a click actually just happened. So like if you really wanted to highlight it is. And then like I said, he did a newer version of it that was like 2/3 of it and kind of made the same claims or whatever it is. But this time he actually didn't go back and actually clarify what was in that 2/3 lump. And even if we kind of, make some assumptions that it's the same type of combination of things as we saw in the first study, whatever it is. This time we actually don't see the percentage of clicks that go to Google owned properties. So that might be in there this time. It might not. It's hard to really say where it ends up. But again, it could very well be the same problems of people that just, don't find what they're looking for and go back. You've got featured snippets, you've got, maps, you've got apps, you've got voice searches, you got other things. So in reality, like that 50% or the 2/3, of searches, whatever it is, the math doesn't add up, right? Because there's a big chunk of it that really are clickers, and there's another ones where that they probably never deserve to click in the first place, and that's arguable, right? You could really see to it, but it just suddenly falls apart, right? And it really kind of brings big question of like what point Rand was actually trying to make with this data, right? And that's something I do go into an article a little bit, because I really want to understand. It's like, hey, look, if you have a solid point here, like if you really are trying to get something to parse that maybe Google is doing something shifty, or that they're stealing clicks or something, right? If there's monopolistic type of practices that are happening, whatever it is, or that it's just harder to be an SEO these days because of this, right? Like I get it. Or like, there could very well be some valid arguments, but this data really doesn't prove that at all, right? And if he was trying to prove that with certain information, he had it elsewhere, right? But that number was too small, I think, for him to actually get a solid like headline out of it. So it certainly wasn't 50%. It certainly wasn't other ones. So things got combined, things got brought together, and suddenly we've got like this great, headline stealing kind of concept that, that over 50% of searches don't get clicked on, or 2/3 of searches get clicked on, and it's just not accurate, right? It just, the math doesn't line up, nothing matches up around it. And, so I had a problem with that. It just didn't make sense anymore. It was, I think my big problem is if his whole point was say that it was harder to be an SEO these days, right? And because, you just couldn't do content enough. In reality, maybe that's a shout out to the featured snippet crowd, right? And I've made that argument before, whether or not Google is really stealing anything. Says like, can you really steal something when you volunteered to give it to Google, when you make so much effort to optimize your page so Google has it? Right? Like, would it be considered stealing, right? And plus Google gives you ways to opt out of this. You don't actually have to show up in Google. You don't have to volunteer for a feature snippet. There's ways of out of this kind of stuff where you don't necessarily have to give that data up. So it's like, well, then no, like you don't get to count that as like a stolen click when you work so hard to get it in the first place, right? Like it just doesn't work that way, right?
That's true.
Yeah. And then you've obviously got all the people that search for something, don't find what they're looking for, and go back on. And that may be a failing of Google, but it's a failing that doesn't hurt anybody. Right. I mean, it's something where like ultimately it just means that, the searcher didn't know how to like search properly, or it's a subject, for once where Google can't actually provide a quick answer for it, or something along those lines. But it's like, again, you can't fault anybody in that thing. That click was never going to happen because they just didn't find it. And that has nothing to do with Google doing anything shifty, whatever it is, because Google didn't get the click either. Yeah, it's not like they, like nobody got it. It went away. They just came back and tried it again.
Yeah,
right.
Who's benefiting? Right.
Yeah, and that's again, it's always the look who's benefiting, and then you'll find the real root of the cause, whatever it is. And I think that was a quote from the Big Lebowski or something like that. Yeah, exactly, whatever it is. But then, like I said, and then you've got that whole chunk that we can just throw out because people really were clicking on it. So again, it's like what I really don't see the point about how this is harder on SEOs, right? For whatever it is. And plus you have to get this idea that, like, again, it's organic traffic, right? It's technically traffic that the Google is giving you, right? And no matter, you can add these numbers up in a variety of different ways to it. But, even if you say like, 6% of their searches go to their own Google properties, about, 2 to 3% go to paid ads, like of the clicks, whatever it is, that means you've still got like a massive amount of clicks that are searches or whatever it is that are actually going towards organic stuff for free, right? And obviously you can, it's not free in the sense that you have to do work to create content and up your site and all those kind of stuff. There's work involved, there's hours needed, whatever it is, but it's not like you're paying Google to get that traffic to come over. It's something that where you have to put in other efforts elsewhere to kind of make it happen. So again, that nothing's really changed on that front, right? And then you've got the argument itself about the featured snippets. That's a tougher one, and that's in some of the follow up today is that it's happened around that. We've had some great honest to goodness, polite conversations about this one. Again, because it does come up constantly whether or not the concept of the featured snippet is really stealing anything. And my point of view has always been the idea that, look, if Google can answer your question like in an easy result, you know, where if you're asking for something like what's the capital of North Dakota, or you're asking what day Easter falls on this year, or, you know, or date specifically, whatever it is, this kinds of thing where it just kind of comes up, whatever. You know, no website owns that information. That's just a fact. That's something that you know, can be calculated or handed over to you, whatever it is. And you know, there may be websites that in the past have made their livings off that by the fact that they had, you know, some, you know, goofy result that was for about the eats or answer, whatever it is, and it had ads all over it, and somebody was making some ad impressions off it, whatever it is. And hey, look, you're very clever, right? But like, you know, like you can't have thought that business model was going to last very long, right? You know, for something that was so like such an easy tip, whatever. And I've always said this about anything, by the way. If somebody can come along and recreate what you're doing that easily, then you didn't have much of a product, right? You know, like it wasn't much of anything. And I always kind of associate back the idea that, you know, if you remember back in the early days of iPhones and camera phones and things like that, there were apps that would turn your phone into like a flashlight. Like it's something where, you know, you could, hey, this is a flashlight app, and you could do it. Originally it was the front screen. Eventually did it with the flash that was in your camera. You can make that and do different lights or whatever. And those existed for years. Sometimes they charge you, sometimes they wouldn't, but it was there. And then eventually all the phones kind of figured out like, well, it's dumb. We can just make that part of the phone, right? So now it's just a button on your phone. And suddenly all those apps were just useless. Nobody would actually pay for that app anymore because it's just built in your phone, right? And again, like if you were an app maker, the correct response in this instance would be to go like, well, it was good when it lasted, right? You know, like, because that's exactly what it was. Like you didn't have a better mousetrap that got stolen from you like that. It was a silly feature that you kind of like highlighted and then it went away. And that's not, you know, that's not stealing anything. That's just capitalism, right? Somebody came up with a better way to do it on their own system. So that's the way it is. And yeah. Like that's just kind of what's happening here is they come up with a great way to answer those questions and come up to it. Google does push it every now and then. Sometimes there are longer answers to it. There'll be like entire recipes in there. There'll be lists of things, whatever it is. And that one, you know, there's an argument to be made there whether or not Google is crossing some kind of line because there's so much information that comes on the page in those instances. It can go either way. And as somebody whose work has become a featured snippet multiple times in it, a lot of my articles I do for the journal end up becoming the featured snippet for it because I write them in a way that would trigger that. And in my case, I don't mind so much because I'm counting on people to go, oh, here's this answer, or like our web page, you know, does Google rank web pages instead of websites or whatever it is? And the answer comes up and they're going to want to click. They're going to understand what I'm talking about and go deeper, whatever it is. So in that case, a click is happening and we know clicks are happening. But the problem is we just didn't know how many clicks are happening, right? So we don't know, like, you know, of the feature snip, how many people actually like jump over or how many people would just do it. And there are some decent arguments again on both sides of this one. You know, one of the guys I was talking to on Twitter this morning about the subject was kind of the idea that, you know, he had his son or his child, I'm not sure what it was, you know, was doing research for a paper and, you know, was just getting answers over and over again without actually ever having to like click through on anything. And I'm going, is that really bad though? That, you know, like in this instance, like the answer was right there, whatever it is, I'm sure your child thinks that's a fantastic experience, that the answers were just there and it comes back and they don't have to click through and do anything, right? And his point was kind of the idea that like, hey, these were on like museum sites and this is this, and people are not going to click through, or they're not going to donate, they're not going to do whatever. I'm going, would they have though, right? You know, like would they actually make that jump, right? If they got the answer they needed to in that instance, like if they really wanted to know, like, you know, hey, this is the ancient capital of Sumeria, whatever it is, then you kind of go, oh, look, tell me more about Sumeria. Then you're going to get people to over there. But if like, you know, if they really just wanted an answer, like they would have clicked over, they would have done a find and, you know, a find function on the page just to go to where they needed to get to, and they would have left anyway. And it would have been like a bad impression for somebody, you know, an ad impression, whatever it is, even if there was an impression, right? And you know, as far as kids using it, like I don't think they're going to be making any donations to the museum, right? Like, so that's probably not the right, you know, the way to kind of look at this stuff. So there's holes in the argument, whatever, but like I'm saying, they're not bad arguments. It's just one of the things where, like, given the fact that again, people volunteer for this stuff to show up this way, they have the opportunity to opt out of it if they actually don't want their data to show these things. it makes it really hard for me to understand how anybody could see that as like stealing, because you really just can't steal something that people are giving away. So, right?
It's really interesting because if
Yeah.
you think that, you should be so lucky to have the opportunity to appear on the first page of something so that you have the opportunity to have a zero-click search.
Right.
It's like just the fact that you're there at all is a sign you're really doing something right.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it just means that, more people are likely to see this, and you hope that the people, even when they're looking and they may not be clicking, but they're picking that information off, they're doing so because whatever the source is seems to be authoritative.
Right.
And so they're already trusting the source, which is a sign again that your authority work is working in a way that's what's getting you there.
To that point, right, is the idea that like they see where it comes from. In that instance, it's listed as coming from the Smithsonian. There is a brand impression that happens in that moment. Like,
Yes.
so they got to go, so the Smithsonian itself is getting some brand appreciation from that kind of effort to it. It's not like Google is actually scraping it off there and saying like, no, I answered this. This is all me. Like they're not doing that. They're definitely saying this is the source of where this came from. And to some people's credit, by the way, like Google has made that mistake before. They've done it with song lyrics and a few other times where it was a sloppy execution of it, and it didn't do right, and you kind of went like, but once they kind of realized like, oh, that's terrible, so don't do that. Like, we're not going to do that anymore. And they stopped and they fixed it, whatever it is. And it, I always kind of say, it just goes to show you, to remind you that Google actually isn't a machine. It's a bunch of people that are making a machine work, and people goof up, and it's not always what you look for.
Your enemy is not Google in this state.
Yeah.
It's the competition of great content on the web, but somewhere else.
Right.
That's really your enemy.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in just what some of the early reaction has been, positive, negative. What have you heard, and what sort of interesting stuff has come out of that reaction?
Yeah. I mean, it's been mostly positive from what I've seen so far. There's been a lot of people that, said, great, I'm so glad you said this out loud and you finally got this down on paper. It needs to be said. There was some, kind of backlash and some things where like, how could Rand do this and things like that. And I didn't necessarily want to like vilify Rand in this instance, right? Is Rand and I have like been on the stage together in the past. I used to count him a bit of a friend. I mean, but it's not something where like we hang out or whatever things. We just do see each other at the same conferences. It's just the way it worked, right? But I'd never personally had anything against the guy, but where I think the problem kind of arises is when you've got that level of celebrity that the information that you share can be taken at face value too easily without anybody really questioning. And it's not to say that nobody was questioning this data. I wasn't the only lone gunman here that was bringing this stuff to the surface by a long shot. There's some really great people, Roger Montini and other ones that actually were doing some great work on this front. But it's something where it does need to be said. It does need to be organized. It needs to be brought to light that's saying, hey, look, if we're running around quoting this number over and over again and using it as the basis for strategy and things like that, you're starting from a false place, I guess is the best way to do it. And you have to just be very careful about that going forward. But it happens, right? And we've talked about this before too. It's really kind of funny in the sense that this data can get picked up by bigger organizations and trotted out in front of Congress as kind of like, hey, look,
exactly.
This is proof that Google is doing monopolistic things and it's causing problems, whatever it is. But nobody bothers to actually do all the research in it. They're standing up there with the 50% number or the 2/3 number, where in reality it's like, you should really only be looking at the 6% number because that's really the number of stuff that Google is keeping for itself. And that's not a giant number. I mean, it's, they're probably making millions of dollars off of that type of activity. Just like they're making billions of dollars off of their search ads and things like that. But again, if that adds up to like 8% between the two of them, or it's still less than 10%, you've still got 90% of searches that are really out to the rest of the world as some kind of public utility. They're a public service of some sort that they've never asked for anything more on. But for some reason, every now and then when they claw a little bit of it back and say, well, we want to do it this way, whatever, people react like it was theirs this whole time. Like it's something where they've been slighted, whatever it is. And I've never understood that level of hubris something that they've been getting free traffic and been using to build their businesses or whatever it is, and without actually having to do anything outside of making sure that their content was well written and things like that. that never sat well with me, and again, and I'm no Google fanboy. I'm not, like
Yeah.
Google has done things, right?
Google.
We know they goof up just like anybody else. It's like I said, it's a crowd full of people, right? So things are bound to happen. But it's one of the things where, I also don't see the need to completely demonize them for things that they aren't doing, right?
Yes.
Like it's the same thing I've always said about politics or whatever it is. Like when people argue about like what the president's doing or whatever it is, and you see some of the just complete wackadoodle stuff that gets shared online about what's happening, and look, there's real things to argue about. Like we can really talk about policy and his decisions on this front, whatever it is. We actually don't need to make things up. Right. Like there's real stuff to talk about, whatever it is. We don't need to talk about, what his son's doing or whatever it is, or not doing or whatever. It's kind of like, who cares? His son's not running the place, whatever. So anyway, but it's like, that's, it's like we have things, we can discuss it. Let's be civil about this, whatever it is. There's no need to kind of like come up with these false narratives to make these guys look bad. They do just fine on their own. Doing that kind of stuff, right? So,
they're already doing a good job.
Yeah.
Well, let me just ask you then, and a final note, where do you think is sort of the leading edge then of the way forward in understanding more about this concept? Is this sort of the dead end of research, or do you think the next 6 months there might be a way to sort of learn more about what's actually happening here and get more useful information out of it?
Yeah. So what's funny is, and I kind of mentioned this before, is that I think the numbers are there. Right. I mean, I think we can see them, right? I mean, we've got a pretty good understanding of how many searches are featured snippets. We've got a pretty good understanding of how many go to Google properties. We have a good understanding of how many go to paid ads, right? So we've got this kind of understanding to what it is. And from there, we can make decisions on like, do we want to, do things that we show up as a featured snippet or not? Do we want to stay out of that pile or not? Do we need to do paid ad search ads? Do we need to do these kind of things? We can make those decisions, right, with the data we have there, and it's what I think we do have in those instances is very directional. I think it's very helpful, as a thing. It may not be as headline worthy as a 50% or 2/3 number, right? But I still think it's something where you go like, all right, we've got a good understanding that this percentage goes to there, and so we might want to try and play in that pile. But yeah. That's where I think it comes from. I think outside of Google actually getting hauled up in front of Congress and being compelled to provide certain information, this kind of stuff, we will never completely know the answer to this one. But it's one of the things where some basic math on this level can at least determine that it's far from 50% and it's certainly not 2/3%, because that's just ridiculous. So.
Well, cool. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of information. Anything else that you feel we have not covered today we should about this?
I mean, it's funny. I'd love to go into more detail about it, like how to get a featured snippet and how to this kind of things. I think that could be its own show for what it is.
Show for sure.
Yeah, it is a very fascinating type of thing. I've been lucky enough to, cause it for certain things. We've certainly got a lot of our clients where we've either helped for it or they stumble into it. You and I are working on a pitch for a new one where we noticed a whole handful of new ones that just happened, and I'm sure they don't even realize it's happening. But it was for some very fun searches that we're going to kind of highlight in these things, but they can happen and they're useful and they're great top of the funnel type things. So they've certainly got a purpose in the world, and there's ways to make it happen if you feel this is a great way to get exposure, which I still believe it is. But not for today. We're going to move on.
Yeah, people are going to have to keep clicking on the Amplitude podcast to get that.
There you go.
That intel. So Jeff, thank you very much. Again, this is Jeff Ferguson, head of production here at Amplitude Digital. I appreciate your taking the time to talk with us about this today.
Sounds good. Talk to you soon.
You bet. And so please stay tuned and check back soon. Stay in touch with us at amplitudedigital.com. And please give us a call if we can help you with a proposal for your own business. Have a great day.